Mother called me on a Tuesday afternoon. I remember because I was in the middle of reviewing a wire transfer report and her name on my phone screen made me hesitate before I picked up. We didn't talk often, not because we hated each other, but because the silence between us had grown so comfortable over the years that neither of us bothered to fill it unless there was a reason. Christmas Eve dinner is at your uncle's house this year, she said. No hello. No how are you. We're doing it right after the candlelight service, so everyone should be there around 8. I told her I'd probably drive up Friday morning. She was quiet for a second. Then she said, Actually, that's what I'm calling about. Your sister's boyfriend. I think you know he's been around a lot lately. He told her he's not comfortable with you being there. She told me, and I talked to your uncle, and we thought it might be easier if you just sat this one out. I didn't say anything for a long time. Easier, I finally said. You know how these things go, she said. He's going to be proposing to her, we think. Maybe at the dinner, and we don't want any tension. I asked her what kind of tension she was expecting from me. She didn't answer that directly. She said something about how I had a way of making people feel judged. That I was hard to read. That Mitchell, that was his name, her boyfriend, Mitchell Hale, had mentioned once that I gave him a bad feeling and he didn't know why. I told her okay. That I understood. I hung up and sat at my desk for a while without doing anything. My name is Corbin. I'm 31 years old. I work in financial compliance for a mid-size asset management firm. I review transactions for irregularities, flag patterns that don't add up, write reports that mostly go to people who skim the first paragraph and initial the bottom. It is not glamorous work. It does not make people gasp at dinner parties. When people ask what I do and I try to explain it, their eyes go slightly unfocused within 30 seconds, and they nod and say, "Oh, interesting," in the tone you use when something is the opposite of interesting. My family has a version of me that they built when I was about 19 and never updated. In that version, I'm the quiet one, the difficult one, the one who moved away and never quite came back. Not emotionally anyway. My sister Becca is warm and loud and calls my mom every Sunday and remembers everyone's birthdays. She was always the one who held the family together at functions, who laughed at the right moments, who made people feel like being around her was easy. I love my sister. I want to say that clearly because nothing that comes after changes it. Mitchell Hale came into her life about 14 months before that Christmas. She'd met him at a friend's engagement party. He was charming in the way that reads his confidence from a distance. Good handshake, easy smile, always the first one to offer to pick up the check in a way that made sure everyone noticed. He worked in real estate development. Or so he said. The first time I met him, he shook my hand and told me he'd heard a lot about me. I said I hoped it was good. He laughed and said, mostly. Then he looked at me a beat too long before turning back to Becca. I didn't say anything to her about it. It wasn't anything I could point to. Just a feeling. I didn't go to Christmas Eve dinner. I drove to my apartment, bought a rotisserie chicken from the grocery store on the corner, and watched a documentary about deep-sea fishing. I texted Becca, "Merry Christmas, love you." She sent back a string of heart emojis. She didn't ask where I was, which meant my mother had told her something, or she already knew, and had accepted it without pushing back. That bothered me more than the being excluded part. Not that Becca had chosen Mitchell. I understood that. People in love make accommodations. But that she hadn't called to say she was sorry, that she'd let it happen quietly, like it was just logistics. I thought about Mitchell a lot over those 2 weeks. Tried to remember everything specific he'd said to me. Every time we'd been in the same room. There wasn't much. He was careful about that, I realized. He'd been around my family maybe half a dozen times and I could barely fill a paragraph with actual things he'd said. What I did remember was one conversation in my uncle's driveway in October. We both stepped outside after dinner. Me to take a call, him apparently to smoke a cigarette he didn't offer to share. When I finished my call, he looked at my phone. Not at me, at my phone, and asked what I did again. Exactly. I gave him the short version. He nodded slowly. Compliance, he said, like he was tasting the word. So you're basically auditing people. I said we were more focused on institutional transactions, systemic risk, that kind of thing. He nodded again, dropped the cigarette, said and went back inside. January was quiet. I worked. I ran. I called my mother once and she asked how the holidays were, and I said fine, and she said good, and we talked about whether my uncle's knee surgery had gone well for 4 minutes, and then we said goodbye. In February, something came across my desk that I almost didn't look at twice. I want to be careful about how I describe my job because I can't go into specific details for obvious reasons. What I can say is that part of what I do involves cross-referencing flagged entities, individuals, or companies that appear on certain lists due to open fraud investigations, regulatory sanctions, creditor actions. It's the kind of work where you look at names on a screen and most of the time nothing connects to anything real in your life. The entity that came up was a real estate development LLC registered in Delaware. The flag was for creditor judgments, multiple, across 3 states, all within the last 18 months. The registered agent on the LLC wasn't a name I knew, but listed as a secondary officer was someone I did know, Mitchell Hale. I sat very still for a moment. Then I did what I do. I started pulling the thread. It took me about 3 weeks to build a clear picture, working only through what was in the public record and through tools I had access to in my regular job. I was careful not to overreach. I documented everything. What I found was not a small thing. The LLC had raised capital from private investors for 2 real estate projects, a mixed-use development in Georgia and a residential conversion in Ohio. Neither project had broken ground. The investors, most of them individuals rather than institutions, had received quarterly updates with fabricated construction milestones. A number of them had stopped receiving updates altogether in the past 6 months. Mitchell wasn't the primary operator. There was someone else running the actual scheme, a man I'll call the principal, who was based in Florida and had a longer history of this kind of thing under a different name. Mitchell appeared to be a recruiter, someone who found investors through personal connections, brought them into the fund, and took a percentage of capital raised. Personal connections. I thought about my uncle's knee surgery. I thought about Christmas Eve dinner. I thought about the engagement that my mother had hinted was coming. I pulled my sister's name through every search I could think of. She wasn't in any of the filings. That was the one piece of relief I had. But she was about to marry this man. I called my sister on a Saturday morning. She picked up on the second ring, which surprised me. She sounded happy. She told me before I could say anything that she had news. They'd gotten engaged on New Year's Eve. She was sorry she hadn't called sooner. Things had been a whirlwind. She laughed the way she does when she's genuinely full of something. I told her I was happy for her. I asked if she could come visit me. Just for a weekend. I said I had some things going on and could use family around. She said yes without hesitating. She came 2 weeks later. The first evening, I didn't say anything. We had dinner, caught up, talked about the wedding plans, venue, guest list, his family she'd been meeting. I watched her face the whole time. She was lit up in a way I hadn't seen in years. Whatever else Mitchell Hale was, he had made my sister feel like she was the most important person in a room. I understand why that kind of thing is hard to see clearly. The next morning, I made coffee and I put the documents on the table. Not all of them. A summary I'd written. 3 pages, clear language, no jargon, with the source links at the bottom. The names, the amounts, the patterns. She looked at it for a long time without speaking. Then she said, "This could be wrong." I told her it could be. I told her I was not law enforcement. I told her the correct next step was an attorney and probably the SEC's investor tip line, and that I had already written down both numbers on the back of the last page. She pushed back from the table. She walked to the window. I let her be quiet. After a few minutes, she said, "He told me there were some legal issues from a business partner a couple years ago. He said it was resolved." I said I understood that. I said the pattern I was looking at wasn't from a couple years ago. She asked me why I hadn't said something earlier, when I first had suspicions. I told her I hadn't had anything concrete earlier, that a feeling wasn't something I could bring to her, that I needed to know before I said anything that I wasn't just being the difficult brother who didn't like her boyfriend. She turned around and looked at me when I said that. Neither of us spoke for a while. Then she sat back down and picked up the pages. She didn't call Mitchell that day. She stayed another night. We talked until almost 2 in the morning, going through everything, her asking questions and me answering what I could. She was scared. I could see it working its way through the first shock of it, the disbelief, and settling into something practical and cold. My sister is not a person without a spine. She had just had it bent slowly enough that she hadn't felt it happening. She called an attorney that week, a real one, someone I didn't know, someone she found herself. I gave her the number for the SEC tip line and she said she'd handle it on her own timeline. What I didn't expect was what came next. About 10 days after her visit, I got a call from a number I didn't recognize. I almost didn't pick up. When I did, it was Mitchell. His voice was calm. He said he knew I'd been talking to Becca. He said he knew what I'd shown her. He said he wasn't sure what I thought I was doing, but he hoped I understood that what I was describing was a mischaracterization of a complicated business situation and that people got hurt when things got mischaracterized. I asked him how he'd gotten my number. He didn't answer that. He said he'd like to meet in person, talk through some things. He named a coffee shop about a mile from my office. I said I wasn't going to do that. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "You should think about what you're doing here, Corbin. You don't know everything about this." I told him I knew enough. Then I ended the call and immediately wrote down everything he'd said with timestamps and saved the call log. He showed up at my office building 3 days later. I didn't know he was coming. I was in the lobby heading to a lunch meeting when I saw him standing near the elevator bank. He was in a jacket and tie, which struck me as deliberate, dressed for a place he was pretending he belonged in. He saw me at the same moment I saw him. Whatever he prepared to say, the way he said it was not what he'd rehearsed. He looked at the building directory behind me. He looked at the name of the firm on the glass. He looked at my badge, and something shifted in his face that I can only describe as the expression of a man who has just recalculated something significant. "You work here," he said. I told him yes. "Doing compliance?" I told him yes. He didn't yell. He didn't make a scene. He actually got very quiet, which was somehow worse. He said, quietly, "You went looking for this." I told him I hadn't gone looking for anything, that his name had appeared in my regular work, that I had done what anyone in my position was obligated to do. He stared at me. Then he said something I've thought about since. He said, "Your family doesn't even know who you are?" I told him that was probably true, and that it hadn't protected him. He left. I filed what I was required to file through my firm. I also personally submitted to the SEC investor tip line. I wrote up everything I had and sent it to a contact at a federal agency through a channel I'd used before on other matters. I am not in a position to describe that in more detail. I called Becca and told her Mitchell had contacted me and then come to my office. I told her what he'd said. She was quiet for a long time and then she said, "Okay." Just that one word, but the way she said it meant something had finished. She ended the engagement 4 days later. She didn't tell me how that conversation went, and I didn't ask. 2 months after that, Mitchell Hale and the man I called the principal were named in a federal civil enforcement action. The principal was also facing criminal referral. The case was described in the press release as involving approximately $4 million in investor funds across multiple states. I didn't call anyone to tell them. I just read the press release and sent the link to Becca with no message. She replied with a single word. "Good." The part I didn't expect was my mother. She called me in March. This time she said hello first. She asked how I was and actually waited for an answer. Then she told me that Becca had told her everything, not just what Mitchell turned out to be, but about the Christmas call, about being told to sit this one out, about how I'd shown up for Becca anyway, quietly, without making anyone feel bad about what they'd done. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I didn't know what you did. I mean, I knew you worked in finance somewhere, but I didn't." She stopped. "I didn't really understand what that meant for you, as a person." I didn't say anything. She said, "I'm sorry I made that call in December." I told her I understood why she did, that she was trying to keep the peace. "I was trying to keep the wrong peace," she said. We talked for 45 minutes. The longest we talked in years. She told me things about her own family growing up that she'd never told me before. I told her some things about my life that she hadn't known. By the end of it, it didn't feel resolved exactly. You don't resolve years of distance in one phone call. But it felt like a door that had been stuck for a long time had finally moved on its hinges. My uncle called the week after that. My sister had told him too. He was direct about it, which I respected. He said, "I let that happen at Christmas without asking a single question. That was wrong." I told him I appreciated him saying so. I went home for Easter. Mitchell's name didn't come up once. Becca looked tired in the way people look when something has passed through them and left them different, but not broken. She hugged me when I arrived, longer than usual, and didn't say anything. She didn't need to. My mother made the same thing she always makes. My uncle's knee was mostly healed. We sat around the table and talked about ordinary things: a neighbor's new car, a cousin's new job, spring coming late this year. Normal things. The kind of things you take for granted until you've spent a Christmas eating rotisserie chicken alone. At one point, my uncle looked at me across the table and said, "So explain to me again what exactly you do." And this time, the whole table actually listened. I still don't think I'm easy to know. I still think I have a way of seeing things that make some people uncomfortable. I still move through family gatherings like someone who's more observer than participant, and I don't think that's going to change. But I'm not the problem. I never was. I was just the one who showed up when it mattered, and that turned out to be enough. I've spent a lot of time thinking about what actually happened here. Not the Mitchell part. That part is straightforward enough. A man built something dishonest, and it eventually touched the one person in his life who had the tools to see it clearly. That's not luck. That's not coincidence. That's what happens when you spend years cutting corners and assuming the people around you are too distracted or too loyal to look closely. What I keep coming back to is the quieter part. The part that happened before any of it. My mother made a phone call in December and asked me to disappear for a holiday because it would be easier. And I let her. Not because I was weak. Not because I didn't have something to say, but because I understood, somewhere underneath the sting of it, that arguing wasn't going to change what she believed about me. You can't talk someone out of a version of you they've been holding for 15 years. You can only live in a way that eventually makes that version impossible to maintain. That's the thing nobody tells you about being the one who sees clearly in a family that doesn't always want to. It costs something. You sit with rotisserie chicken on Christmas Eve, and you watch a documentary about fishing, and you feel the specific weight of being excluded by people who should know better. And you carry it quietly because making it loud doesn't serve anyone, least of all you. But here's what I know now that I didn't fully understand then. The discipline of being careful, of not acting on a feeling until it becomes something you can actually stand behind. That same discipline is what protected Becca. If I had gone to her in October with nothing but a bad feeling about Mitchell, she would have defended him. She was in love. She would have thought I was being exactly what my family always said I was: difficult, judgmental, the one who makes things hard. I would have pushed her closer to him. So I waited. I built something real. And when I sat down across from her with 3 pages of documented truth, she couldn't look away from it. Integrity isn't just about being honest in the moment. It's about being honest in the right moment, in the right way, with something solid enough to hold weight. That takes patience most people don't want to practice. It takes the willingness to look like you're doing nothing, when you're actually doing the hardest kind of work there is. In the intelligence piece, I don't mean that in a self-congratulatory way. I mean that the skills I'd spent years building quietly, in a job nobody found impressive at dinner parties, turned out to be exactly the thing that mattered when it mattered most. Your expertise is never wasted. It just waits for the right problem. What Corbin's story comes down to, what my story comes down to, is this. The people who pushed me to the edges of the table didn't make me smaller. They gave me distance. And from a distance, I could see everything. Mitchell saw my name on that building directory and understood in about 4 seconds what my family hadn't understood in years. That is its own kind of answer. I'm still not the easiest person to know. I still observe more than I participate, but I showed up for my sister when it counted, quietly, without asking for credit, and I would do it again without hesitation. That's not something I learned. That's something I chose. Every day, in small ways, long before December ever came around. Choose carefully what you build in the quiet years, because one day someone is going to walk into a room and need exactly what you've been building.